A small country made a move that most powerful capitals believed would never happen. What looked like a technical legal decision quietly disrupted assumptions about control, legitimacy, and fear that had held for decades. So what does this really mean for you? And why does Ibrahim Traoré suddenly matter far beyond Burkina Faso? Because once this line was crossed, political outcomes began moving faster than the stories designed to explain them. What you are about to hear is not the version of events that circulates most easily, nor the one that feels safest to repeat. It is a clearer look at the mechanics behind a moment many observers prefer to simplify. You will understand what is actually shifting and why reactions diverge so sharply. This is not information meant for passive listening. If you stop here, it becomes tempting to reduce what is happening to familiar labels like instability, authoritarianism, or regional chaos. That framing feels reassuring, but it hides the incentives that guide real decisions. Without seeing those incentives, it is easy to misread silence as weakness, speed as improvisation, or restraint as confusion. Staying with this analysis means understanding why some leaders reacted immediately while others avoided public comment, why investors recalibrated before statements were issued, and why legality became a battlefield rather than a safeguard. Missing that means watching events unfold without the tools needed to interpret where they are likely heading. What changed was not just the arrest or the accusation, but the decision to move everything into public view. A process usually hidden behind legal language and diplomatic silence was deliberately exposed, forcing observers to confront details they rarely see laid out so plainly. Within days, one fact stood out: the speed. From the moment the allegations surfaced to the announcement of a televised military trial, the timeline compressed into a window measured in days, not months. That compression mattered because it removed space for negotiation, mediation, or quiet pressure behind closed doors. The context begins earlier, with a fragile political environment shaped by repeated coups, unresolved security threats, and deep mistrust toward institutions that promised reform but delivered little. When Ibrahim Traoré came to power, expectations were already polarized. Supporters saw urgency and rupture as necessary. Critics warned that concentration of authority would follow. Both sides were watching closely for a defining test. That test arrived when accusations against a former head of state moved from rumor to formal charge. The seriousness was not only in the alleged crimes, but in how they were framed. Coup plotting, assassination attempts, and collaboration with armed groups were presented not as isolated acts, but as part of a broader pattern threatening national survival. By choosing a court-martial and announcing full transparency, the leadership signaled that this was meant to be exemplary, not procedural. The first groups affected were political elites across the region, many of whom recognized familiar vulnerabilities. If precedent shifted here, it could travel. At the same time, ordinary citizens reacted differently. For some, the public process promised accountability long denied. For others, it raised fears about escalation and retaliation. What made the moment especially tense was that neither interpretation could be dismissed outright. Transparency became both reassurance and provocation, and from that point forward, the issue was no longer only about one defendant. It became a live experiment in how power, justice, and legitimacy interact under pressure at this stage. The story stopped being abstract because a clear guiding figure emerged in how events were framed and explained. The role was not simply that of a decision-maker, but of someone positioning himself as the interpreter of consequences, both domestic and regional. Ibrahim Traoré did not present the process as a technical necessity. He framed it as a test of whether authority could still claim moral ground under extreme pressure. The first visible impact appeared inside Burkina Faso's own power structures. Senior officials, military commanders, and institutional actors suddenly had to recalibrate behavior. Silence became cautious. Public alignment became measured. Even routine statements were delayed or stripped of certainty. The message was clear. Precedent was being rewritten in real time, and misreading it carried risks. A second impact followed almost immediately beyond national borders. Regional leaders and observers began responding not through declarations, but through restraint. Meetings were postponed, language softened, attention shifted from condemnation to observation. This reaction mattered because it showed that the move was being treated less as a domestic incident and more as a signal event. For citizens watching from within the country, the effect was more complex. Some saw the process as long-awaited accountability, a moment when powerful figures could no longer rely on immunity. Others worried about what happens when exceptional measures become normalized. Both reactions coexisted, and neither could be ignored. What made this phase decisive was not agreement, but recognition across institutions, borders, and social groups. People understood that the situation had crossed into a different category. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether the action was justified in theory. It was how far its consequences would reach in practice. It began quietly, almost deceptively so. A legal move was announced. Language was careful. The tone suggested procedure, not rupture, for a brief moment. The situation appeared containable, something that could be absorbed and managed within familiar institutional rhythms. Then the trigger phase hit. An arrest became public. Charges were named. The scope widened. What followed was immediate reaction rather than reflection. Statements were issued and then revised. Allies hesitated. Opponents recalculated. The speed of events made it clear that this was no longer a slow-burning political dispute. It was an activation point. The escalation phase unfolded faster. Confessions were mentioned. A military court was confirmed. Broadcast transparency was promised. Each step added pressure. By moving proceedings into full public view, the leadership removed the safety valve that normally allows disputes of this kind to dissipate quietly. There was no extended pre-trial fog, no gradual leak of information. Instead, developments arrived in sharp bursts, each one narrowing the space for denial or reinterpretation. Reactions multiplied. Within the military, uncertainty replaced routine. Officers watched not only the charges, but the framing. Civil servants waited before aligning publicly. Regional governments slowed their responses, choosing observation over commentary. The absence of loud condemnation became its own signal. As the climax phase took hold, the narrative widened beyond the defendant. Allegations expanded from individual wrongdoing to systemic threat. The language shifted from misconduct to betrayal, from political rivalry to national security. That shift mattered because it redefined what kind of response would be considered legitimate. Once framed as existential, compromise became harder to justify. The pace continued. Names were hinted at. External links were implied. Boundaries blurred. This was the moment when control felt uncertain. Each new detail raised anticipation of the next. The public followed closely, not because clarity increased, but because stakes were visibly rising. The process began to feel less like a trial and more like a countdown. Then came the aftershock phase. The intensity did not disappear, but it settled into a heavier silence. Investors paused, diplomats waited, regional actors avoided firm positioning. Inside the country, conversations shifted from what happened to what could follow. What could not be undone was the reset. The decision to accelerate, to expose, and to frame the events as exemplary had altered expectations. Even if the trial itself ended quietly, the method had already changed the landscape. From that point forward, nothing about authority, immunity, or consequence could be discussed in quite the same way. The timeline did not close a chapter, it opened a longer one, defined less by the initial act than by the precedent it created. Before weighing motives or narratives, it helps to pause and look at scale, not the dramatic language, but the measurable contours of what unfolded. This is the point where impressions give way to weight and where claims either settle into substance or collapse under scrutiny. The first anchor is scope. Multiple individuals connected to the alleged plot were detained and publicly identified within a very short period, with more than 5 appearing on national broadcasts to give confessions. That number matters less as a statistic than as a signal. It showed coordination rather than isolation, and it shifted the event from a single accusation into a networked case. For observers, that immediately changed the category of risk being assessed. The second anchor is speed. From the initial public acknowledgement of the allegations to confirmation of a televised military trial, the process unfolded in a span of days rather than the months typical of comparable cases. The baseline expectation in the region has long been delay, opacity, and procedural drift. The delta here was compression. That acceleration reduced the ability of external actors to shape outcomes quietly and forced reactions to occur in real time. The third anchor is exposure. Broadcasting confessions and announcing a fully public court-martial represented a sharp departure from precedent. In similar situations, proceedings are usually fragmented, partially disclosed, or deferred indefinitely. The shift to total visibility altered incentives across the board. Political elites could not rely on ambiguity. Military figures could not assume internal resolution. International partners had to consider reputational risk alongside diplomatic posture. Another measurable effect appeared in behavior rather than numbers. Statements from regional governments slowed noticeably. Scheduled meetings were delayed. Public commentary became cautious and abstract. This behavioral delta suggested recalculation, not confusion. Silence functioned as risk management, indicating that the move was being treated as potentially precedent-setting rather than symbolic. For investors, the metrics were indirect but no less telling. Attention shifted toward legal predictability and enforcement signals rather than short-term instability headlines. The argument presented by Ibrahim Traoré was explicit. Equal application of law, even to former leaders, reduces long-term uncertainty. Whether one accepts that claim or not, the framing targeted a specific audience accustomed to evaluating institutional credibility through enforcement patterns. Finally, the human impact provided its own scale. Public reaction inside the country was intense and sustained, with attention holding across days rather than dissipating after an initial surge. That persistence suggested that the event resonated beyond spectacle. It touched unresolved expectations about accountability, protection, and consequence. Taken together, these measures point to a single conclusion. This was not a routine legal episode amplified by rhetoric. It was a calibrated intervention designed to alter timelines, visibility, and behavioral response. Once those variables shifted, the system itself began operating under new assumptions. And systems rarely revert once their baselines move. There is a serious opposing view that deserves to be stated clearly before any judgment is made. Some observers argue that no matter how grave the allegations, the process itself creates risks that may outweigh its intended benefits. From this perspective, the concern is not sympathy for the accused, but fear of precedent. The first argument is that extraordinary transparency in a military trial can blur the line between justice and performance. Critics contend that broadcasting confessions and proceedings may influence public opinion before a verdict is reached, placing pressure on institutions meant to remain insulated from emotion. In fragile political environments, they warn. This can undermine the very rule of law such actions claim to defend. Justice, in this view, should be insulated, not amplified. That concern is not trivial. Public pressure has distorted outcomes in many historical cases, particularly where institutions lack long-standing independence. However, this argument assumes a baseline where opacity protects fairness. In contexts where secrecy has repeatedly shielded impunity, transparency functions differently. When informal power networks are strong, visibility can act as constraint rather than distortion. The risk is real, but so is the cost of the alternative. The second argument focuses on stability. Critics suggest that moving too aggressively against former leaders or senior figures risks provoking backlash within the military or among regional allies. From this angle, restraint is seen as a tool of preservation. Slow processes, negotiated exits, and quiet settlements are believed to reduce the chance of retaliation or cascading unrest. Again, the logic is understandable. Sudden shocks can fracture already strained systems. Yet this view often overlooks accumulated instability created by unresolved accountability. Delayed justice does not neutralize tension, it stores it. Over time, that stored pressure surfaces in more unpredictable ways. What appears stable may simply be brittle. When both arguments are placed side by side, the picture sharpens. The debate is not between justice and chaos, but between different kinds of risk. One path accepts short-term volatility to reset expectations. The other prioritizes calm while allowing underlying incentives to remain intact. Understanding that trade-off does not resolve the question automatically, but it does clarify it. The issue is no longer whether the move was extreme, it is whether the cost of not acting had already become higher than the cost of acting openly. Everything changed again. Up to this point, the focus had remained on the trial itself and the immediate political shock it generated. Then a second layer emerged, one that reframed the entire sequence not as a legal endpoint, but as a strategic signal. The move was not only about judging past actions, it was about reshaping how future challenges would be handled. What became clear was that the process was designed to be watched, compared, and remembered. By placing accountability in full view, the leadership implicitly invited external actors to reassess their assumptions about leverage. Quiet pressure, backroom mediation, and informal guarantees suddenly looked less reliable. The message was subtle but firm. Traditional tools would no longer operate the same way here. This shift altered the rhythm of the story. Attention moved from the defendant to the audience. Regional governments, security partners, and financial observers were no longer passive commentators. They were participants, forced to interpret whether this approach would hold or collapse under pressure. For Ibrahim Traoré, the midpoint revealed something more personal as well. The choice locked him into a path with limited retreat. Once expectations of transparency and consequence were set publicly, reversal would signal weakness rather than prudence. That commitment raised both credibility and risk at the same time. From here forward, the story was no longer about whether the process would proceed. It was about what kind of political environment would exist after it did. Once the midpoint passed, consequences began showing up beyond speeches and legal documents. They appeared in decisions, delays, and adjustments that affected different groups in different ways. The shift was no longer abstract. It started to touch how systems actually functioned. For the state, the immediate impact was pressure. Governing institutions had to operate under heightened scrutiny, knowing that precedent had changed. Legal decisions carried more weight because they were now judged not only internally, but by regional and international audiences. This increased the cost of inconsistency. Policy choices became harder to reverse quietly, and credibility started depending less on promises and more on follow-through. That narrowed room for maneuver, even as it strengthened the authority of enforcement. For businesses and investors, the effect was mixed but tangible. Short-term uncertainty increased as headlines focused on confrontation and risk. At the same time, longer-term assessments began shifting toward enforcement patterns rather than political noise. The signal emphasized predictability through accountability rather than stability through accommodation. Some actors paused commitments, others recalculated exposure. The market response was not panic, but caution paired with renewed due diligence. For ordinary citizens, the impact was the most immediate and emotionally charged. Public attention remained high, not just because of the personalities involved, but because the process touched unresolved expectations about fairness. For some, seeing powerful figures subjected to visible procedures reinforced trust that consequences might finally apply evenly. For others, fear grew that escalation could invite retaliation or instability. Daily conversations reflected both hope and anxiety, often at the same time. The regional dimension added another layer. Neighboring governments adjusted behavior subtly rather than openly. Public rhetoric softened, diplomatic engagement slowed, silence replaced criticism. This was not neutrality, but calculation. The possibility that precedent could travel made many actors cautious about taking firm positions. The issue was no longer confined to one country. It became a reference point for how authority might be challenged or defended elsewhere. Internationally, observers treated the episode as a test case. Security partners watched for signs of institutional resilience or fracture. Financial institutions monitored whether transparency translated into enforceability. Advocacy groups debated whether visibility protected rights or exposed vulnerabilities. No single conclusion dominated, but attention remained fixed. What tied these consequences together was reach. The decision did not stay within courtrooms or speeches. It altered expectations across governance, economics, society, and diplomacy. Under Ibrahim Traoré, the move forced each group to respond, even if that response was delay or silence. At this stage, one thing was clear: the effects were no longer theoretical. They were already embedded in behavior, and once behavior shifts, returning to the old baseline becomes increasingly difficult. The most likely scenario is one of controlled tension. The process moves forward without dramatic collapse or sweeping regional rupture, but it does not fully normalize either. Institutions adapt to higher visibility while learning where new limits lie. Governance becomes more cautious, not freer, and more deliberate, not faster. Stability holds, but it is a stability under watch, shaped by the awareness that enforcement now carries public consequence. This path is neither triumphant nor disastrous. It is functional, restrained, and demanding. A more optimistic scenario depends on follow-through. If transparency is paired with consistent procedure, the precedent could strengthen institutional credibility over time. Legal processes become clearer, expectations stabilize. External partners adjust to the new rules rather than test them. For citizens, confidence grows not from spectacle, but from repetition. Accountability stops being exceptional and starts becoming routine. This outcome requires discipline and patience, but it is not unrealistic if restraint matches resolve. The worst-case scenario emerges if momentum outruns capacity. Heightened visibility could amplify missteps, turning procedural errors into legitimacy crises. If outcomes appear selective or uneven, the very transparency meant to protect credibility could undermine it. Internal fractures may widen. Regional actors could reassert pressure indirectly. In that environment, escalation feeds itself, and authority becomes reactive rather than anchored. What began as a demonstration of control risks becoming a test of endurance. What matters across all three scenarios is not prediction, but preparedness. None of these paths unfold automatically. Each depends on decisions made after attention fades and cameras turn elsewhere. The early signal has already been sent. The question now is whether behavior aligns with it consistently enough to shape expectations rather than chase them. The lesson is simple but demanding. The future here will not be decided by how bold the initial move appeared, but by how steadily it is sustained. Understanding these scenarios is not about choosing which one feels right. It is about recognizing that outcomes are shaped by discipline long after the moment that drew the world's attention. After the broader dynamics and possible futures are laid out, the question narrows to something more immediate. What does all of this mean for the person watching, listening, or following events from a distance? The answer depends on where attention and exposure already sit, but no one is completely outside the frame. For those who actively follow politics and global affairs, this moment offers an advantage and a responsibility. Early understanding provides context before narratives harden. It allows signals to be read before they are simplified. The risk for this group is overconfidence. Rapid shifts reward curiosity, but they also punish certainty. Staying engaged means tracking patterns rather than committing too early to conclusions. For those affected indirectly, through work, markets, security concerns, or regional stability, the impact is quieter but real. Decisions made far away can reshape opportunity, risk, and planning horizons. Even without direct involvement, uncertainty travels through supply chains, investment climates, and public mood. The most useful response here is not alarm, but adjustment. Expectations may need recalibration, timelines may need flexibility. Awareness becomes a form of preparation. Then, there are those who feel untouched by events like this, who assume the story belongs to another place or another audience. That distance can feel reasonable, but it carries its own risk. When change arrives without warning, it is usually because attention arrived too late. Understanding the baseline does not require obsession. It only requires recognizing that large shifts rarely announce themselves loudly at first. Across all three groups, the common thread is agency. Watching passively leaves interpretation to others. Paying attention creates room to think, question, and adapt. No one needs to choose a side to benefit from clarity. Understanding the structure of the moment is enough to avoid being surprised by its consequences. If this moment is to matter beyond symbolism, solutions cannot remain abstract. Statements alone do not stabilize systems, and visibility without follow-through quickly loses credibility. The real question is what practical steps can convert attention into durable structure. At the central leadership level, the first requirement is consistency. Legal procedures must follow clear timelines, defined standards of evidence, and predictable safeguards. Success here is measured not by severity, but by regularity. When similar cases are treated similarly, expectations begin to settle. For Ibrahim Traoré, this means aligning rhetoric with repeatable process, so that enforcement looks institutional rather than personal. The second step belongs to institutions and organizations operating within the system. Military and civilian bodies need explicit boundaries separating investigation, adjudication, and execution of outcomes. That separation reduces internal friction and limits the perception of concentration. Progress is visible when decision chains shorten without collapsing into single points of control. And when internal compliance replaces external pressure. The third step rests with the public and civil society. Engagement does not require mobilization or confrontation. It requires attention, tracking proceedings, understanding procedural rules, and recognizing deviations create informal accountability. Change at this level is measured through expectation, when fairness becomes assumed rather than demanded. A fourth step, where possible, involves regional and international partners. Engagement should shift from judgment to calibration. Clear criteria for cooperation, security assistance, and investment reduce speculation. When partners know what triggers response and what does not, volatility decreases. The final measure of success is endurance. Solutions only work if they persist after attention fades, if transparency, consistency, and restraint remain visible months later. Credibility compounds. If they weaken, skepticism returns quickly. In the end, execution is what decides whether this moment resets the system or merely disrupts it. The roadmap is not complex, it is demanding, and its value depends entirely on whether it is followed when the spotlight moves on. Earlier, the story introduced a figure positioned not only as a decision-maker, but as a guide through uncertainty. That image returns now, not as a symbol of certainty, but as a reminder of how much has already changed. The moment that once felt isolated has unfolded into a sequence with weight, consequence, and direction. From the initial shock to the recalibration of institutions, the journey has moved through tension, exposure, and adjustment. What began as a legal act became a test of expectations, not just for those directly involved, but for anyone watching how power responds when challenged publicly. Along that path, assumptions were stripped away, replaced by harder questions about accountability and endurance. For Ibrahim Traoré, the story has never been only about authority. It has been about choice under pressure, and about what remains once attention shifts elsewhere. The decisions made here do not exist in isolation. They echo through systems shaped by memory as much as by law. This is why the moment lingers, not because it offers easy conclusions, but because it forces recognition. Recognition that structure matters, that precedent accumulates, and that moments like this leave marks long after headlines move on. The final truth is quiet but persistent. When power exposes itself to consequence, it also exposes its future. And from here forward, that future is no longer shaped by denial, but by what follows next. After following this story from its opening shock to its longer implications, it is worth acknowledging that reactions will differ. Some will feel concern, others may feel cautious optimism. Many will still be undecided. That diversity of response is not a weakness. It reflects the complexity of what is unfolding. If this analysis felt useful, it is likely because it slowed the moment down enough to be examined rather than consumed. Moments like this are rarely understood in isolation. They gain meaning when discussed, questioned, and compared across perspectives. Understanding deepens when interpretation is shared rather than held alone. If you believe this is a story others should understand with more context and less noise, consider passing it along, not to persuade, but to widen the circle of informed attention. Conversations grounded in structure tend to age better than reactions driven by urgency. And if you choose to respond, the most valuable contribution is not agreement or disagreement, but reflection. What stood out to you most? Which consequence feels most significant? What signal do you think will matter longest once attention fades? This space works best as a dialogue, not a verdict. However you engage, the fact that you stayed through the full arc already places you inside the conversation rather than outside it.